Well, good morning, everyone. I'm John Casper of the Oshkosh Chamber, and welcome to this month's edition of our monthly HR briefings with Von Briesen and Roper. We're pretty excited about today's program. We have a discussion around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, policies, programs for consideration. Certainly a hot topic these days, and something that's on a lot of organizations' minds in terms of how they address policies within their work environments. I believe we're going to be recording this session like we generally do, and it'll be up online on our website later today. So if you want to go back, refer back to that, you can do that. Share it with others, and we will be promoting that. So, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jim Macy with Von Briesen and Roper, and have Jim introduce our other panelists and the discussion for today. So Jim, take it away.
Thanks a lot, John, and it's great to continue our program and our relationship with the Chamber. On behalf of our whole team, employment team, the whole firm, Von Briesen, happy to continue this series. John, as you know, at least for the time being, we'll be doing some monthly updates, employment updates, on the third Thursdays of the month, I believe, John, is what we've got scheduled now.
Yep.
So stay tuned for other topics. I want to introduce a couple of my colleagues from a couple of our other offices. And what's nice is we have a broad base of talent and people. These two are not only colleagues and shareholders of mine, but also they're friends of mine. We've done a number of programs together. In fact, Jeff and I have even worked together at a couple different firms going back in history. But Ann Barry Hanneman is here this morning, and Jeff Trotier is here this morning, and they're going to kick us off into this program. I also want to put a plug in for them. For those of you within your companies that may not be able to participate today, they're going to do this program again next week, October 20th, and you can link into that program as well through the Von Briesen website. So with no further ado, let me turn this over to Ann and to Jeff.
Good morning, Jim. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Jeff Trotier. I'm an employment attorney with Von Briesen and Roper. And as you can see from the slide, which hopefully if I hit the buttons right, I am sharing, we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. So for those of you who work in HR, you know that we have so many acronyms. We call it the alphabet soup of HR. So this acronym that we love to throw around is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're going to talk about various policy and program considerations today. So over the past 8 months or so, most businesses and organizations have been focused on how to adjust, or how to really just sometimes stay afloat among the ever-changing legal obligations and market changes brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, current events, including the Black Lives Matter protests across the state and the country, in addition to the Me Too movement, have really brought our attention and our focus as employers back on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that we can make for the benefit of our workforces, which in turn benefit our organizations. So today we're talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm just going to repeat it until that acronym is natural for everyone. We're going to talk about this in very broad terms. Yes, diversity includes all of the typical categories that we talk about in HR law. Everything we think about when we think about the WFEA, Title VII, race, color, age, creed, religion, sex, sexual orientation, veteran status, disability, religion, and the many others that I've just missed. But it also includes socioeconomic diversity, diversity of life experiences, anything in an employee's background or experiences that have shaped how they interact with the world, how they interact in the workplace, how they approach problems and situations, and generally how they think. So as a result of that, we do want to discuss the response as employers, as businesses, as organizations to the current movement, and to evaluate our current policies and programs and think about where do we need to adjust, where do we need to grow, where do we need to keep pace with the standard that's set for us by the EEOC and the Department of Labor. We want to assess our current level of effectiveness and consider what are the next steps for the company, for the organization, or if you're a public sector employer, for your municipality or your department as well. So that, of course, brings about several challenges for us as employers. We need to create a workplace and a culture that values and promotes diversity, inclusion, and equity. Okay, so how do we do this? These are very nice words that I'm giving you, but of course we have to have a plan in place. To have a plan, we have to see where we start off. So we need to develop and implement a strategy to support and achieve our business or our organizational objectives. So this can start many, many ways, but we do want to consider what kind of educational programs do we have addressing things like DEI and cultural bias. We want to look at our policies. As a lawyer, Anne's heard me say this a million times, but it always gets me a cheap laugh from her, so I'm going to go for it. I love policies. I love policies so much. They're my favorite thing in the world. I want one of those little mugs that says I heart policies on it, and I would use it every day. Because as a lawyer, that's what we live and breathe by. Whenever we have to defend a case, the first thing we do is we go to the policies. What notice did the employees have of this? These are the rules that govern how we behave in the workplace. So we want to really look at our policies again and see how they comply with current thinking about DEI. Once we have those policies updated, because a lot of us have great policies that were really great in 1998 when we drafted them, but we put them in a file. We have some perfunctory reference to them when we onboard people, and that's it. So let's dust off those policies. Let's update them. Let's make sure that they have current statutory and regulatory language in them. Then we want to train on those policies. Again, not just checking off that acknowledgement of receipt at the back of the handbook when we onboard, but have regular annual training. Then we also want to look at our recruiting processes. Consider how you're going to target your recruiting to create a more inclusive workplace. This is an ongoing conversation. This is not just performing that annual training. This is it's more than getting just an attendance signature and moving on. It's retooling your whole workplace and how your employees and your business partners engage with each other and interact with each other. So it's giving your workforce new tools to discuss things. It's also, we approach this with the creation of internal affinity groups. So when I think about, let's say, lawyers or accountants or something that's more of an associational group, do you have a black lawyers group within your organization or an Asian American accountants section in your accounting firm? Well, what do you do if your organization isn't big enough to really sustain that kind of population? You can just have a generic diversity, I know that's inherently oxymoronic, but a generic diversity affinity group. So the diverse lawyers, however they define themselves, the diverse accountants, the diverse comptrollers, something like that. So you can aggregate your diverse populations so that they can discuss their experiences and bring those experiences back to leadership. We also want to monitor our goals and initiatives. We want to see where we started so we can see where we have to go. So before you start retooling, take an initial poll of your employees. Determine what their understanding is of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Review your policies to see if you do need to revise. Consider how you're going to train on these new policies, and then train on them regularly. Not just getting up and reading them, but something that's interactive. So you're actually actively teaching these policies. Consider respectful workplace training and educational training. So we'll talk a little bit more about respectful workplace training later, and what that means and how that's different from our more traditional harassment training. Consider making educational training available for all of your employees, of course, but also targeting your diverse populations. Then review your workforce makeup. Make sure that it is representative of your external labor pool. So if you do have a shortfall there, think about where can you focus your recruiting efforts to remedy any shortfall? Are we looking at job fairs? Are we looking at minority job fairs? Are we looking at job placement nonprofits like Goodwill? Or are we looking at active recruiting at HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, or other places where you can bring in a more diverse workforce? Then review your community involvement. Think about what charities your organization or your business is involved with. What chambers of commerce do you regularly engage with? Do you engage with things like the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce? And what other external affinity groups you may be involved with? So from there, let's talk about reviewing your diversity-related policies. What you see on this slide are all the policies that generally as an employer you should have. So first question is, do we have all of these? Do we have an equal employment opportunity policy? Does it address hiring? Does it address employee referral programs? Do you have, or do all of these, especially your EEO policy and your anti-harassment complaint procedure, do they specifically include all protected classes? And by that I mean, we need to go through and make sure that every class that's included in the Wisconsin Fair Employment Act, in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, are they all mentioned there? Is it all clearly included? Are you using the actual statutory language? Does any of that language actually need to be updated? Are they clearly written? I don't mean lawyer clearly written, but average person clearly written. So can your employees really understand what you're saying, or does it just sound like so much legalese? I'm guilty, as every other lawyer is, of giving policies out and contracts that say in 10 words what could be said in 3. So make sure you're saying it in 3 words and not in 10. Because these policies, it's great to have them, but they must be clear. They must be understandable. Otherwise, A, they don't get the job done. They don't educate your employees, but also they don't provide as much legal coverage either. If the EEOC sees a gigantic policy that you have to read 5 times to understand, they're going to say, well, that's not actually really proper notice to your employees. Are your policies cross-referenced? So we talk about an electronic communications policy up here. Does that include a statement saying that your electronic communications can't or should not be used for harassment purposes and are subject to the harassment complaint procedure? So you're cross-referencing these things. Not only does it give you extra coverage and it tells the employee where to look if there are questions, but that's just frankly something the EEOC and the ERD loves to see. Are they accessible? By accessible, I mean, are you handing them out in a hard copy to employees during onboarding? When you revise a policy, are you sending that out to your employees? Are they available through your intranet? How are you making them available? There is a dusty, musty old case out there that says that if your employee handbook is sitting on a shelf in the break room and the employee can get to it, that does mean it is properly accessible. That case is very old. We are much more nimble and electronically savvy now, so let's not rely on that. Yes, we have that case, but we shouldn't have to rely on it. Another great time when to review all of these policies is during the annual review process. I don't mean go through page by page in your employee handbook, but point out the highlights. Say, okay, I'm glad we've talked about your goals and where you've come during this last year in our review. Now let's just make sure you understand where we are as an organization and go through those policies to say, if you have any questions, these are the people to talk to. These are what we like to say are your multiple channels of reporting. In other words, the 2, 3, or 4 people you can come to with a complaint. Make sure you remind them of this during the review process. Also, have at least the highlighted policies posted somewhere, whether it's outside of HR on the bulletin board or by the time clock, something like that. Now, what is in our ideal harassment policy? Again, being a lawyer, madly in love with my policies, I have ideals about this. First of all, we've all seen the typical harassment policy. It defines physical harassment, it defines visual harassment, and it defines sexual harassment. This is extremely typical. Somewhere at some point, someone put a boilerplate policy somewhere on the internet, and everyone has downloaded the same policy. You see it in every handbook. And it always says something to the effect of, and sexual harassment bears particular mention, and now we're going to define that at length. Unfortunately, that policy that everyone has grabbed from the internet was written a couple decades ago. It's a little bit outdated, so we need to make sure that our policies, no matter where the model came from, are up to date. So let's review what we include in our sexual harassment policy. At this point, we've come a long way. So your harassment policy needs to make sure that it does address same-sex sexual harassment. It needs to address harassment on the basis of transgender status. It also has to tie into social media. And harassment can be something that does take place off work premises during non-work time, using non-work channels. Now, this gets a little sticky when we're looking at private sector versus public sector, so please call your lawyer if you have questions about what is being said on social media, and if that does implicate the workplace if you're a public sector employer. You have much more broad latitude if you're a private sector employer. Again, the caveat is, are the discussions that are going on social media, do they cross over into National Labor Relations Act, protected speech about terms and conditions of employment? But if they're harassment is still harassment. Protected speech no longer is protected once you are harassing. If you are harassing at any one of these bases that you include in your harassment policy, in your EEOC policy or your EEO policy, you've crossed a line, and this is harassment that does need to be addressed. So do please look at your policies and make sure that they are up to date. Make sure that they differentiate between in-person and online harassment, and that online harassment is still harassment. This applies not just to employees, but to vendors, clients, anyone who comes into your physical or virtual space. Make sure you reference a clear complaint procedure. You don't need to repeat the complaint procedure in every policy, but at least reference to where that complaint procedure can be found. So there's been a drastic change in how the EEOC, and as a result, us as employers, look at harassment training over the last few years. The classical model of harassment training was what I like to call fire and brimstone, fear of God training. We would go through all of the laws and say, this is where it can go wrong, this is what you shouldn't do. It was a lot of don't do this, a lot of nots. And we realize when training anyone, just like when teaching anyone, just focusing on the negative doesn't get the job done. We have to focus on what they should do. So the EEOC commissioned this years-long study. It came out a couple of years ago, stating that we really want to put the emphasis on respectful workplace conduct. Once you have respectful workplace conduct and a respectful workplace, the incidents of harassment, of discrimination, of retaliation go down drastically, and we can get to the business of running our business. So our employees should feel trained and confident in reporting at the end of this training. They should feel like, I know how to address a problem. I feel comfortable and empowered to address my problems head on. I can go and address it. Or if I don't feel comfortable doing it, I know who to talk to in HR. So basically, although it sounds a little bit basic, we're going to see something, say something model. If your employees see harassment, if they feel harassed, they should feel free to speak up. If they see one of their coworkers being harassed, they should feel free to either speak up on their behalf or to use certain techniques to help extricate the person from that situation. All of this should be done in the most respectful, civil manner. And those are the tools that we as employers and we as the people who train our employees, we give those tools to our employees so they can accomplish that. So we want to ensure that all of our employees are comfortable reporting and at least know the reporting avenues. And if they are comfortable, address inappropriate conduct. They can do this directly. Another wonderful thing about respectful workplace training is it helps employees really develop the type of camaraderie and relationship between each other where they know they can respectfully stick up for themselves. They may do it in a kind of jokey manner at first because, okay, let's all recognize we've been trained in how to do this. And it feels a little bit artificial, but then they do realize, wait, this makes a lot more sense. We are all adults. We can all handle our problems. And this is how we've been given the tools to do that. So make sure your employees have this notice that they are empowered to do this. And this, in turn, does create the camaraderie necessary to support your colleagues. So to do this, we really do need to kind of reboot our culture of civility here. I'm very proud that I have my little rebooting graphic here. I don't do a lot of graphics, but it seemed appropriate at the time. So let's remember that culture of an employer really does make all the difference. This makes work a decent or at least a safe place to be. And we can't underestimate how much that comfortable and safe workplace matters to our employees. So we really need to lead by example. One of my more depressing statistics that I like to pull out is, let's look at our average day, 24 hours. You have to pretend a little bit for this one to make sense, but we have a 24-hour day. Let's first pretend that we sleep for 8 hours as our doctor tells us to. So that leaves us with 16 hours. Let's then pretend that we only work for 8 hours a day. So 8 of that 16 hours, that's half of your day. That is half of your waking life that you are at work. That's the depressing part. So we want a workplace where we spend half of our waking life, where we appreciate this culture, where we are happy to be there, where we are proud to be there. We do this by rebooting this culture of civility. We have to create a culture of respect where inappropriate behavior and harassment are not tolerated. We do this by teaching our employees that they can address it immediately. This doesn't have to just wait till their annual review to bring it up. And where they can go to address it immediately. This makes them feel incredibly valued as employees and just increases morale exponentially overall, which therefore increases productivity. You have happier workers. It's a great place to be. Now we have this little comment that I have at the bottom here. Well, that's just Pat. He doesn't mean anything by it. Okay. That's an excuse that a lot of employers have. We all have this one quirky employee who has been there forever and they have great institutional knowledge. They're the person we go when we have a problem. The Mr. or Ms. Fix-It. And so we kind of put up with their quirky behavior because they're extremely valuable. Well, we can't use this excuse anymore because we just have to put Pat on notice, not in an adversarial way, but in an educational, collaborative way, that we can't put up with this quirkiness anymore. You said something that's wrong. We don't just brush it aside. We have to say, this is what you said. This is how you said it. This is how it makes other people react. And Pat will say, oh, I didn't mean anything by it. And that's probably really true. Pat just doesn't understand. But both from a very common sense place and also from a legal place, Pat's intent isn't what matters. Whether or not Pat meant anything wrong, that isn't what matters. It's the person who heard it, how they reacted, how they perceived it. That is what matters, because it's how someone takes the comment that affects the workplace. And also from a legal perspective, that creates liability. Pat needs to understand, here's what you said, here's why you shouldn't say it, and here is all of the history behind it. And just have a very constructive conversation with Pat. Pat will fall again, and that's fine, but it's an ongoing conversation. And that's, again, how we have to model this respectful behavior at the top of our organization and reward development of respect. We reward it by addressing it in annual reviews, individually with employees, but also with supervisors, with managers, saying, okay, we're going to look at this just from a number standpoint. We had X number of internal complaints this year. They've gone down. They've been handled so much more smoothly. So great job as a supervisor, great job as a manager. You are educating and training your staff. And this is how we progress. And this is how we've been able to get back again to the business of running our business. So contributing to a respectful workplace. Excuse me. The goal is that all of our communications are respectful, productive communications. And again, we want our employees to feel empowered to constructively address inappropriate statements, like I've just said. Perhaps a little bit maybe ad nauseum, but again, I'm a lawyer, that's what we do. We repeat ourselves over and over again. So if someone is not okay, they need to know this is the type of workplace where you don't have to accept that. So let's be aware of a colleague's discomfort and teach our employees how to do this. Most of us do have an inherent understanding of visual cues. Still, in this training, point out those visual cues to your employees, confirm their instincts. If you see someone who has reacted poorly to someone else's comment, how can you step in and use this kind of step up, speak up model to the extent that your employees are comfortable doing this? We're not asking them to go out and be enforcers. We're asking them to act within their comfort zone. They need to know that this is not just acceptable, but it is encouraged, yet again, not required. Your activity in stepping up and speaking up can be speaking up to the HR director saying, I saw this, they looked uncomfortable, I know it made me feel uncomfortable to witness it. Then HR at least has noticed that there is an issue. HR is screaming out. They want to know what's going on. They don't want this brushed under the rug. Once they know, they can do their job and investigate and educate. So also teach your employees distraction and extraction strategies. How can you get a coworker out of an uncomfortable situation? I like to say, think of kind of a really awful cocktail party or holiday party that you've had to go to, where you have to get your spouse or significant other out of a really dreadful conversation. It's the same kind of concept. Just call someone over and say, hey, can I have you look at this? Or I wanted to ask you a question about this. If you see someone who is in an uncomfortable conversation, that's a really great way to break the tension and just get them out of it. They don't have to go over and be the enforcer and stand menacingly behind their coworker's back. They just have to say, hey, come here for a second, I have a question. That will diffuse the situation so quickly. Also, teach your employees to know when or how to call in additional support. Remind them, again, this is not their obligation to handle alone. Support is available. That support is their right, and here are the several people they can go to for support. For this, we do need management buy-in, of course. This is not all on HR's shoulders. So top leadership really does drive the culture. Management must take a strong and consistent public stand against inappropriate and harassing behavior. This comes from the organization's policymakers. And this can be very simple actions. This doesn't mean that the CEO has to drop everything and run training by themselves, but they do need to be present there. They need to show that they stand behind this, that the buck stops there, basically. Management needs to show that there is a commitment to diverse, inclusive, and a respectful workplace. Make your mid-level managers and frontline supervisors tangibly accountable to prevent or respond to inappropriate behavior and harassment. Empower them to make the changes they need to create that respectful workplace, whether it's having weekly lunch and learns on it or monthly lunch and learns, or just walking through the policies occasionally. Make sure you have education available for your leadership on respect, cultural tolerance, and legal exposure. This is training, not just on the law, but on DEI and cultural competence. This leads to a better place to work for all. This increases productivity and also reduces attrition. With that, I believe I am turning the slides over to Anne. Yes?
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Of course.
And as Jeff underscored, really a respectful workplace is one in which individuals, as Jeff mentioned, feel comfortable working and are less likely to leave your employ. As we look at the war for talent and keeping our key employees, the work environment is so critical to that mission. And that's where we see a lot of employers looking particularly at diverse, equitable, and inclusive strategies to retain and use the value of the collective differences of the employees as a whole. As we keep in mind, Jeff touched on the value of diversity. But really, when we're looking at the bottom line business value, it is the goal to make sure the employer captures that collaboration of differences to its business advantage. When we look at the business environment, again, Jeff mentioned the policies, but how do we integrate those policies and make sure that those policies are living and breathing in our organization, and also they are integrated with what we do? When we look here at the culture of empowerment and cooperation that Jeff touched on, we really, as employers, need to look at that culture. The culture is really how we do things, not what we do, but how we do it. And what benchmarks describe our environment. When we're looking at a respectful workplace, this slide highlights the markings or traits of a respectful workplace. Individuals are treated fairly. No one is given a free pass. The example Jeff gave about Pat, somebody who makes off-color jokes, that individual isn't given a free pass, and the individual employees know that all our employees are expected to be treated fairly and respectfully. Differences are acknowledged and valued. Again, that commitment from the top, as Jeff mentioned, is real critical, that we underscore through our policies, through our daily activities, that differences are valued, whether that's the protected characteristics being brought to the workplace, in addition to different styles, different opinions. People bring their personal experiences, and bringing their whole selves to work is valued and respected. And it is how we do things at the employer. The communication is open and civil. If there are disagreements, those different disagreements can be met with respect and collaboration and problem solving. It is not finger pointing and disrespect. Conflict is addressed early, And Jeff touched on the importance of making sure managers and supervisors and also coworkers know what's expected of them. And different to how we've trained in the past is alerting coworkers that you too have a responsibility to step forward if there is an issue between coworkers, between a manager and supervisor. Again, if you don't feel comfortable addressing it, you know where you can go to ask for help. But those types of conflicts are addressed immediately. Oftentimes, people leave employment because they don't feel valued. And again, developing integrated policies, valuing that respect in all the things that we do will go a long way in retention, therefore enhancing that business value. The next slide, please, Jeff. And when we look at the culture of respect, as I mentioned, that conduct plus communication, how we deal with one another, addressing inappropriate behavior, not only because we have to from a legal exposure standpoint, but again, it is who we are. When we look at vision, when we look at mission, is the value of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment in our purpose, and how do we then translate that into what we do? Do we continually evaluate the culture? Again, what do we say and what do we do? Jeff mentioned taking surveys as a barometer about what does our work environment mean to our employees? Where can we improve? In what areas do employees value the cooperation or collaboration with coworkers? Get a handle on that perspective from employees, and how and in what ways can we make changes that will enhance the value and experience for each individual. When we particularly look at managing a diverse workforce, there are different styles and different environments that bring out the best in individuals. And what fosters the best from our employees? That may be different between Jeff and myself. And how do we tap into those differences, those approaches, to really bring out the best in the productivity from all employees? Approaching that model, valuing that, leading by example, goes a long way. And that really encapsulates what we're looking for in a diverse and inclusive environment. You know, when we think of inclusiveness, we do think of how do we engage individuals? How do we promote that culture of respect so individuals want to work with one another, want to collaborate, and know that their differences are making a difference in that company. And again, it is going to be something that feeds that retention. The next slide, please. Both Jeff and I kind of touched on the importance of a respectful workplace, but I think this is something that employers really need to underscore with employees. Why is it so important for our organization to promote a respectful workplace, develop that culture, and hold each other accountable? It supports good mental health, holds people responsible for their actions. Oftentimes, when we hear people leave employment, they don't feel valued, they feel disrespected from their supervisor, and they have had enough. And it's often environmentally driven. And that is something we all need as employers to tap into. Losing individuals and having to retrain is a bottom line concern for most employers. And it has been in recent years. How do we become an employer of choice? When we look at the third point here, fostering a workplace that embraces diversity. When we look typically, and think of diversity, we typically think of numbers. I'm going to use the word quotas, but how many minorities do we have at this firm? Think about that broadly enough such that you develop an environment that fosters diversity and developing programs, and we'll talk about training and educational opportunities for employees that show that as an employer, we are committed to developing diverse talent, integrating that diverse talent, and making sure that there is engagement from a diverse employee base. When we talk about inclusion, we really are focusing on the engagement. And as each company, again, DEI isn't a one size fits all, but as you look at individual employment relationships, what will work, knowing our employee pool that is going to be promoting that type of commitment, improving work relationships, problem solving, and conflict resolution. Again, all of that underscores that respect. We look at the business value, increasing productivity and engagement. And supporting a workplace culture of fairness and equity. We see these across all lines. And again, the Jeff's phrase, "I heart policies," that is really where we see our policies in action. It is not enough, okay, we see the visual, but it is not enough to heart policies, but what do the policies really mean in action? It's one thing to have an EEO policy that says all employees are treated equally with respect to terms and conditions, but it is another to hold each employee accountable. If there is unfairness, your employees know it, and they will not stay in an environment where they believe that employers treat other people more favorably. Absenteeism, I'll just use that as a common example. If individuals are really working, doing the right things, and they see their colleagues get away with not pulling their own or not being held accountable, that leads to the bad perception that people are not treated fairly. We don't walk the walk. Again, keep in mind when we're looking at policies, very important about how we translate that culturally in how we do things. The next slide, please. One thing I did want to highlight here, we covered some of these things, but I think one thing that we don't want to overlook, and I think one of the challenges that employers looking at, okay, how have I done in DEI? What are my next steps? How do I assess where I'm at? Listening to others is critical. It's one thing to provide policies, this is how we do things, but it's another to listen to employees, getting that feedback from employees about how and in what type of environment do you feel most comfortable. Learning and educating other employees and developing some type of mechanism where employees can learn from each other and management can listen to employees about finding out whether there are any barriers for bringing their whole selves to work. Do they feel valued? And what can we do as an employer to value the differences and work more collaboratively together in making a comfortable workplace? Again, making a workplace we can be proud of. If we achieve those things, in all likelihood, we are going to keep and retain those high quality employees. And are we willing to, if there are things that have gone on that haven't exactly promoted what we say in our policies, make no sincerely apologize if individuals have been not handled adequately, and move forward, develop better systems, but develop that communication avenue, an avenue where individuals can provide feedback, and by feedback, honest feedback, that individuals won't feel retribution because they've brought forward a concern. Developing a constructive environment where individuals can feel free to bring forth concerns about the work environment, concerns about coworkers, again, in a manner that is not finger pointing, but one that is done collaboratively and with respect. The next slide. When we're promoting learning related to diversity, respectful workplace training is something, as Jeff touched on, that employers are really looking to that different workplace training than has been gone on in the past, a little more expansively than, you know, the don't do this, this will violate our harassment policy. But stating it in the constructive, what we do expect from employees, what constitutes disrespect, provide some examples, make that training interactive, show employees by example what is expected. Jeff gave a couple of examples about the extricating, the becoming an active bystander. If you see something, do something. Provide real meaningful leadership to your employees about what it is that an employee is expected to do in those types of situations. When we look at implicit or unconscious bias training, providing that training can be very valuable in the context of developing a DEI training program and educational program. Recently, we've seen the executive order issued by President Trump prohibiting stereotyping when providing implicit or unconscious bias training. And that applies to federal contractors and subcontractors. And that executive order addresses the fact that the training that is expected to be provided must be done without sex or race stereotyping, in that the training does not enforce the concept that because you are white, you are racist, but it requires the training to focus on that individual people may have biases that can influence conduct, and that conduct may be perceived as by others as offensive. And how do we deal with that in the workplace should that occur? Again, importance of providing those training opportunities for individuals with the goal of really emphasizing the value, the tolerance, and the emphasis that because of these differences, we are better as a work environment and better as a company. And again, how do we work together, recognizing our differences and really valuing those differences? Next slide. Jeff had touched upon affinity groups and employee networks, where individual companies may have within their organization an affinity group that is recognized by the company to promote DEI efforts. A segment of our law firm, for example, allowing individuals that are African American to meet, confer, network, and talk about how and in what ways the company is providing support and developing those individuals and allowing those individuals to talk about encouraging how they can develop within the firm professionally and personally. And really the focus of such affinity groups or employer groups is really to talk about the inclusion and what opportunities are available, and focusing on in what ways can barriers be eliminated, minimized, or reduced by the company to allow individuals who are diverse continue to flourish and thrive in the environment. When we look at, and you can go to the next slide, Jeff, thank you.
Actually, Ann, if I could interrupt for a second.
Absolutely.
Thank you. We have a question, and we do like to have questions and handle them as we go through slide by slide instead of waiting till the end, because we don't want to ignore a question. One of the participants has asked, what can a job developer do to motivate employers to hire diverse individuals such as people of color, people with differing abilities, or people with a criminal record? And do you want to take that one? Otherwise, I'm happy to yammer away.
Sure, and feel free to jump in. I think one thing, you know, when we're seeing the proliferation of these DEI efforts, I think one thing certainly that persuades companies to look at the value is the business case. There are a number of studies that show that companies with diverse employee groups within it are more profitable, almost by 30% in some studies that I've seen. That making the business value case is something that is persuasive. There are a number of articles also written, and I'd be happy to provide some to you, and feel free to connect with me, that talk about diversity efforts. And we have a slide coming up talking about the fact that $8 billion gets spent on diversity efforts. But oftentimes, when we look at what stumbling blocks DEI efforts see, is they don't make the value case and the tie to the success that employers do have and the competitive advantages that employers with diverse efforts and employees see, falls by the wayside, and it really doesn't become integrated, that individual companies are really checking the boxes that, hey, if I add a minority within a particular department, I've done my job. That's why diversity and inclusion really go hand in hand, because it's really the inclusiveness and the engagement that really provides that business and competitive advantage. Jeff, did you want to add?
Just a little bit, and then I'll let you get back to the slides. Thank you. Yeah. Also, in having the conversation with the potential employer, one of the helpful points to bring up is when you consider your workforce, and if they all can fit in the same statistical model, then you're getting a workforce with the same background. That means they've gone through the same challenges in life and they've overcome those same challenges. But with those challenges, they've had certain learning experiences. If you have an applicant who has had different challenges in life, maybe they've come from extreme poverty, maybe they've had to work their way through school, maybe they're a person of color and have experienced challenges that go along with that. They've also developed abilities to overcome those challenges, and ways to look at problems that the rest of your workforce may not have. That's extremely valuable. Being able to look at a problem from a different viewpoint from the rest of your workforce, you are opening up a whole world of this skill set of being able to meet other challenges because of basically their life experiences. That can be a very compelling argument for hiring. And as far as people with a criminal record, just always please remember, we can't make hiring decisions based on criminal record unless the position and the sorry, there's a lot of traffic honking outside the window right now, so it's a little bit distracting. But unless the conviction is substantially related to that position, always, always, always run those criminal background checks post-offer, pre-hire. If you do it any earlier, the ERD will find probable cause if you get sued. We do also have another question that just popped up. Thank you for that. It says, what suggestions do you have for businesses and employers to integrate individuals with disabilities into their workforce? Well, that sounds like a reasonable accommodation question. I want to keep it brief because it's a little bit far afield from what we're talking about today. Disability accommodation is a whole 2-hour program in itself, and maybe one that the chamber wants to tackle on a subsequent date. But that will go, in that you will have to go through, of course, getting medical documentation, looking at the duties of the position, seeing what they can or cannot do without reasonable accommodation. And when you're looking at those duties, really look at the position as it is today. Talk to the supervisor and ask the supervisor what they do, what is important to the job. Don't just stick with that job description that was created 10 years ago. It may have progressed since then.
And I'll just take a little different tack on that question from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. If the employer is interested in bringing individuals with disabilities onto the payroll and hiring individuals, I've seen companies be successful in partnering with organizations that do provide job coaches for individuals with disabilities and exposing individual employers or teams to individuals with disabilities. We've also seen in the Milwaukee area success partnering with organizations that specify or specialize in, and I'm referring to the Joseph Project, if some of you are familiar with that project, that it fosters relationships with individuals who are coming out of the prison system looking for work, and where employers have really partnered with these organizations in making sure individuals are job ready, bringing them on premises and employing them and going through the interview process. But there are a lot of ways in which individuals can tap those resources to consider hiring individuals from a diverse group like disabilities, like those that may have a criminal background. And again, you know, that may be part of the outreach that is and comes out of these DEI efforts. One thing, in just getting back to the material, and hopefully that answers your question, please feel free also to follow up with Jeff or I outside the program as well. We're happy to provide any information that we can. When we're looking at creating employee networks, depending upon your work complement, you want to make sure that we clarify the purpose and tasks with the goals and the business objectives. Certainly, the affinity or employee group's purpose is designed to allow individuals with diverse backgrounds to flourish in the organization, reduce any barriers, and to develop mentor relationships. One thing an employer can do is look for continued support groups for affinity groups as well. And opening that up for discussion and educational opportunities can foster the support for a minority population within the employer group. The next slide, a couple of caution pieces about legal considerations, and Jeff touched on a couple of these earlier about implications if the individual groups, sometimes getting together, it may promote discussion about bad treatment, disrespectful treatment, and potentially that kind of behavior that becomes a real complaint session, if you will, about the employer. Be careful about those inappropriate comments that may stem out of that. Again, Jeff had mentioned the Section 7 rights, making sure we're not taking adverse action against any individual who's engaged in protected concerted activity regarding terms and conditions, but reinforcing the maintenance of any policies to address that. Jeff touched on the electronic communication policies, but making sure all of those policies in tandem support the anti-harassment and support that respectful workplace environment, and that will go through social media or otherwise. The next slide. Also be concerned about discrimination concerns, about a perception of exclusion. Certainly employee network groups, affinity groups, are designed not to provide favored treatment for individuals, but to allow for the networking and the real focus to be on reducing barriers through employment that may be experienced by that minority group, and making sure we're doing a good job as an employer communicating the role of that group and the value it does have. The next slide. When we're looking at empowering these employee groups, making sense to involve leadership to the extent that you can, and allowing the educational opportunities for other employees to learn from affinity groups. Again, we all bring different experiences and backgrounds. Individuals, for example, by race, may be bringing that unique experience to the workplace. And educating others and developing those supportive allies. Consider immersion learning experiences. As to the question about bringing on individuals with disabilities, maybe you have a volunteer operation opportunity dealing with a disability community organization that's local, getting folks involved and having that experience working and doing things with those from the disabled community. That will open doors because you're developing that relationship, having a little more familiarity with individuals with disabilities, recognizing the talents of individuals with disabilities. Last week I attended a program and a disabled individual was talking about that specific issue about hiring individuals with disability. And he said, the #1 trait individuals with disabilities have is they are resourceful. They overcome, they look for ways to accommodate. So, there is real value in looking at those hiring opportunities for those that are disabled. Continue to monitor and develop some type of needs assessment, looking at ways in which the employer can make modifications and improve DEI efforts. This is not, DEI is not a destination, it is a journey. All companies will face barriers, bumps in the roads, but continuing on and improving through the course of time will certainly advance and foster that important mission. And just, Jeff, if you want to just bring up the last slide, I touched on this a little earlier, but when we look at the success and the outcome and the business value that meaningful DEI results have provided companies, not only with respect to the culture, but giving a competitive advantage, we really encourage all companies to look at what can we do, where can we recognize that value, now how do we develop our policies, procedures, and programs to get us there. And I'll leave you with this quote. You can't mandate diversity, but you can mandate diversity, meaning the numbers, but you can't mandate inclusion. And that's where we take it to the next level, changing hearts and minds of employees to work collaboratively, valuing those differences, and leading to a more equitable workplace. And with that, I think we're wrapped up. Jeff, did you want to add any further comments? We're a little over time, I think.
I don't think so. I just want to respect everyone's time. Thank you all for participating this morning. Thank you for the questions we received, and be well.
All right. Well, behalf on our complete team at Von Briesen, certainly want to thank Ann and Jeff for joining us today. We like to rotate different members of our team through to talk about the different topics. And again, thanks, John, Casper, and to the Chamber for allowing us to put on the programs and to provide information to folks.
And thank you to Von Briesen and Roper, another great program. And the next one, as Jim mentioned earlier in the opening comments, we're going to be doing these every Thursday, every third Thursday of each month. So be looking for that next one. I believe it's the 19th of November. One day before the opening of deer hunting season, I believe, or two days. So make sure you circle that on your calendar. Be looking for that. We'll be promoting that shortly as soon as we get that topic. So again, we recorded this. So this will be posted on our website if you want to go back to the program and view some of the segments of this again and share it with others. So with that, we thank you all for joining us, and we will see you again next month.
Yeah,
Thank you, John and Jim.
Thank you.